On this episode of Kinokot, post-war reconstruction, Cold War tensions, and Eisenstein's final project. After World War II, creative freedom in the USSR was more restrictive than ever before. Andrei Zhdanov, a high-ranking secretary in charge of ideological content, organized several campaigns aimed at criticizing art incompatible with the socialist realism, however vaguely defined. No film director or genre was safe from criticism, and a strict approval process ensured that by the end of the 1940s, film output reduced to less than 20 films per year, down to only 9 pictures in 1951. This period is commonly known as the picture drought. The heavy losses at the box office were rectified with an unexpected solution. Despite the anti-Western mood of the time, a decision was made to show foreign films, captured from the German Reichsfilmarchiv. When shown, these movies omitted the usual credits and began with the title card stating, "This film was captured as a trophy after the defeat of fascist German troops by the Soviet Army near Berlin in 1945, often followed by additional information for context. Thus, many American films made it onto the Soviet screens, sometimes controversially so, as the USSR typically did not bother to obtain the proper licensing rights. These movies gave Soviet citizens a rare glimpse through the Iron Curtain. One of the most popular films, however, was a German one. Millions were fascinated by the musical comedy The Woman of My Dreams and its star Marika Rock. Influenced by the wartime life, Soviet art had a brief opportunity for genuine realism. Mikhail Rom's Dream, completed immediately before the war, is a believable portrayal of ordinary people looking for their place in life. A quirky variety of tenants in a Polish apartment building are united by their pretense of being respected citizens. An artist reduced to fixing kitchenware, an engineer with a stack of rejected projects, an unmarried woman desperate for companionship, a cabbie without fares, and a village girl trying to make it in the big city. Only Madame Skorohod, the building proprietor played by the talented Faina Renevskaya, considers herself to be part of the successful elite, but perhaps she is not so different from the rest. The fact that the film is meant to be a propaganda picture aimed at criticizing the bourgeoisie way of life does not diminish its value in drawing unforgettable portraits of people and their dreams. The Four Hearts, a romantic situation comedy directed by Konstantin Yudin, was completed in 1941. Its lively mood was incompatible with the realities of that difficult year, and its release was postponed for a more appropriate time in 1945. Galia is a no-nonsense mathematics professor. Her younger sister Shura is an easygoing college student. The sisters move to the countryside where they meet two bachelors, one a military man, the other a biologist. The pairs eventually form couples, but not before the mandatory light-hearted hijinks, a welcome sort of escapism after years of struggles. Much of the Soviet Union was still in ruins in 1947, but in the world of cinema, people lived carefree lives in utopian apartments. In Grigory Alexandrov's Springtime, Arkady, a film director, is making a movie about Irina, a devoted scientist played by Lyubov Orlova. Irina has little patience for trivial things like starring in movies, and Arkady hires Vera, a lookalike actress, also played by Orlova. The two women meet, become friends, and even switch places with expected humorous outcomes, as Arkady takes great care to remember which one of them he's in love with. Fancy parties, advanced science facilities, and busy Moscow streets gave the impression of a country completely untouched by war. As the western parts of USSR were being rebuilt, there was a simultaneous large-scale push to develop the natural resources of Siberia. The Train Goes East, a romantic drama by Yuli Reisman, literally takes the viewer across the entire country immediately after the Victory Day. On the way to the far eastern city of Vladivostok, Zina, a chatty agronomist, has to share a train compartment with Nikolai, a stern Navy officer, much to her and his dismay. The two passengers are separated from their train and must embark on an improvised journey, helped out along the way by a military cargo plane, an old man with a horse, and a company of jolly women tractor drivers. By the end of the trip, the clashing of the unlikely companions naturally grows into a romantic relationship. The Ballad of Siberia, directed by Ivan Peryev, is a story with a premise very similar to The Train Goes East, albeit much less subtle. Andrei, a virtuoso pianist, suffers an injury in the war which prevents him from playing the piano. Depressed, he leaves his musical life behind, along with his beloved Natalia, and moves to a remote construction town in Siberia. By chance, Natalia, played by Peryev's wife Marina Ladinina, visits the same town, and the past feelings reignite. Inspired by the massive new developments throughout the USSR, Andrei finds his new calling as a composer and writes a symphony acclaiming the Soviet industrial accomplishments, the titular Ballad of Siberia. Ivan Peryev's Cossacks of the Kuban is an ode to the Soviet farmers. As two collective farms compete in production output, a farmers' fair is held to praise their copious achievements. Galina and Gordey, the directors of the opposing teams and professional rivals, grow closer during the competition. The plot has many common elements with the contemporary socialist realism comedies. The lack of a villain or a conflict, and a forced competition between the good and the best, in which the winner is irrelevant. The story comes to a climax during the fair, where the viewer meets the true main stars of the film: household goods, cars, and countless heaps of produce, all tediously sourced for the set from the scarce supplies of famished post-war Moscow. This blatant distortion of reality became the reason for the film's removal from theaters during Khrushchev's rule, although its melancholic songs survived and are still performed today. In 1947, the country celebrated 30 years of the Soviet rule. In the same year, Mark Donskoy directed The Village Teacher, a film dedicated to the Soviet educators. In Imperial Russia, Varvara, a young university graduate, becomes the first school teacher in a small village. During her long career, Varvara lives through the First World War and the Revolution, finds her first love, and experiences her first loss. She sees her students graduate, then sees them off as they leave to fight in another war. Her tiny cabin schoolhouse grows and becomes a multi-story building in which she is the principal. Relatively absent of typical propaganda, the film expresses gratitude to the several generations of Soviet teachers, and the lead star, Vera Moretskaya, delivers a solid performance in her ageless role. For reasons not entirely clear, the late 1940s saw an influx of Soviet films with naval themes. Some were adventure pictures, such as A Captain at 15. Based on a Jules Verne work, it follows Dick, a young man who must take the command of a sail ship after its captain and crew are presumed lost. Unknowingly to him, a man aboard the ship sabotages the course, and Dick and the passengers arrive in a slave-trading region of Africa instead of their South American destination. In the early Cold War period, Soviet films criticizing racism were quite common, and A Captain at 15 was no exception, with the slavers being the main antagonists and the lead characters rescued by their black companion in a rather clever plan. Similar themes continued in Maksimka. In the mid-19th century, a Russian corvette attempts to pick up the survivors of a wrecked slaver ship, but only finds one person, a young boy. Despite the language barrier, the boy becomes friends with the crew. Luchkin, one of the sailors, takes a particular interest in the boy, naming him Maksimka and crafting a miniature sailor uniform for him. The plan to leave the boy ashore during a stop in Cuba is aborted when Luchkin witnesses the racism of the locals, and the British ambassador in Hong Kong shows visible disappointment about providing care for a black child. Luchkin and the rest of the crew are elated when they learn that Maksimka will be staying aboard. By the late 1940s, the Cold War was quickly gaining speed, and the Soviet films reflected the events in a number of anti-American spy films. The Russian Question by Mikhail Rom depicts an American journalist who refuses to write negative articles about the USSR. The Secret Mission, also by Rom, described the real-life secret negotiations for the local German surrender to the Western Allies. Kalatozov's Conspiracy of the Doomed followed an anti-communist plot by Western agents in an unnamed European country. And in Farewell America, an unfinished film by Alexander Dovzhenko, a reluctant American journalist is tasked to spy on the Soviet Union. Even comedy director Grigory Alexandrov made a serious Cold War picture with his Encounter at the Elbe. At the end of hostilities in Germany, a city is split between Soviet and American zones of influence. Major Kuzmin takes control of the Soviet portion, and Major Hill of the US Army takes over the American half. The two commandants become good friends and often meet to discuss politics off the record. An American woman named Janet approaches Kuzmin with a favor, but Kuzmin surmises that Janet attempts to smuggle out a war criminal. When Major Hill attempts to help Kuzmin, he discovers that Janet is a CIA officer and loses his job. Andrei Zhdanov's anti-cosmopolitan campaign targeted foreign influence in every aspect of Soviet life, from arts to sciences. The works of Jewish authors were particularly scrutinized as anti-patriotic, regardless of the actual message. This period brought forth a multitude of biographical films claiming various achievements as being purely Russian. The movies praised Russian figures from all fields, such as composers Glinka, Mussorgsky, and Rimsky-Korsakov, radio pioneer Popov, selectionist Michurin, physiologist Pavlov, aerodynamics researcher Zhukovsky, literary critic Belinsky, and explorer Przhevalsky. Veteran filmmaker Vsevolod Pudovkin, known for several successful historical dramas, found appropriately patriotic messages in the Crimean War. The titular Admiral Nakhimov, played by Alexei Dickey, leads a fleet through a number of victories over the Turkish forces. Facing overwhelming odds, Nakhimov makes a daring move of sinking his own ships and moving the cannons offshore, defending Sevastopol in a heroic last stand against the Turks and their European allies. The film was the target of heavy criticism while still in production for being supposedly unhistorical, and Pudovkin was forced to make significant changes before the release. Mikhail Rom's Admiral Ushakov is quite similar to Pudovkin's Nakhimov. In the late 18th century, Ushakov trains his sailors using unorthodox methods and tactics. Ushakov's fleet makes an excellent impression on the visiting Empress Catherine the Great, leading to a promotion. Supported by Great Britain, Prussia, and France, Turkey begins a war with Russia with the goal of capturing Crimea. Ushakov skillfully defeats the Turks at Fidonisi and later repeats his success on a larger scale with a victory at Tendra. Like in Nakhimov, the Western European nations are shown as a parallel to the Cold War narrative. Still during the war, Sergei Eisenstein began work on his largest project yet. Ivan the Terrible was supposed to be a trilogy of films about the controversial Russian Tsar. Part 1 begins with the Tsar's coronation in the year 1547, played by Nikolai Cherkasov. The film follows Ivan IV through many events, such as his wedding, the Great Fire of Moscow, and the war with Kazan. When Ivan becomes seriously ill, his cousin-in-law Yevrosynia plots to place her feeble-minded son Vladimir on the throne, while Prince Kurbsky remains loyal to the Tsar. Her plan unsuccessful, Yevrosynia plans to assassinate Ivan's wife Anastasia. Despite being made in wartime, the film was an impressive production, with elaborate costumes, creative cinematography making great use of shadows, and a fitting soundtrack by Sergei Prokofiev. Joseph Stalin was very pleased by Part 1, awarding the director and the crew Stalin's Prize, first grade. Eisenstein quickly continued work on the second film. In it, Ivan suffers several setbacks, learning that his friend Kurbsky is a traitor. In a flashback, Ivan recalls how, when he was a child, the nobleman mistreated him and poisoned his mother. The Tsar organizes the Oprichniki, a private army of trusted men, and earns his famous nickname. The film culminates with a rowdy feast, shot in color, during which the Tsar discovers and punishes the people scheming against him. However, Part 2 was met with a storm of criticism and banned from release. In a speech to the Central Committee in August of 1946, Stalin openly criticized ideological shortcomings of several films. About Ivan the Terrible, he said the following: Eisenstein has completely moved away from history. He showed the Oprichniki as the lowest of bastards, as degenerates, as something like the American Ku Klux Klan. Eisenstein did not understand that Oprichniki were a progressive army. Ivan the Terrible was a man of great will, of character, but according to Eisenstein, he's some sort of feeble Hamlet. This is formalism. We don't care for formalism. We need the historical truth. Eisenstein was devastated. In a public letter, he was forced to admit, "We forgot that the most important thing in art is its ideological content and historical truth. The strict warning of the Central Committee stops us, the Soviet artists, from continuing down this dangerous path. The path which leads to art that is empty and devoid of ideology. To art for art's sake, to a creative degeneration." In February of 1947, Stalin and high-ranking politicians Andrei Zhdanov and Vyacheslav Molotov personally met with Eisenstein and Cherkasov. The filmmaker learned that Stalin has no issue with showing Ivan as a violent ruler, as long as its necessity was made obvious. But Stalin also asked for a number of changes and made the decision to combine parts 2 and 3 into one film. Eisenstein made no obvious efforts to continue working on the film. Already suffering from poor health, he passed away a year later, in February 1948. A few years later, in March of 1953, Joseph Stalin died, ending some 30 years of his rule and closing a major chapter in the country's history. Many of Eisenstein's colleagues, the pioneers of the Soviet cinema, also passed around the same time. Yakov Partizanov in 1945, Mikhail Dollar in 1952, Vsevolod Pudovkin in 1953, Dziga Vertov in 1954, and Alexander Dovzhenko in 1956. These directors may be gone, but their many brilliant films set a high standard and continue to teach the future generations of filmmakers around the world. In the next episode of KinoCod, de-Stalinization, romantic ideals, and the freedom of the thaw.